Good morning. Today we have a little break from our normal history reader to read from Story of the World. So we've read from this a few times this year. It is a really interesting book that has basically the story of different parts of the world throughout history. And so it will bounce back and forth between what's going on and possibly, Italy we were just talking about with the Roman Empire, maybe what's happening in China at the same time and in South America. So we are specifically reading portions that go along with our history book. And today we're going to hear about the mythology that the Vikings believed in, which was called Norse mythology. And the most famous of the gods that we are going to hear about in Norse mythology is Thor. Many of you know of because of the Marvel movies. So that Thor is inspired by the Viking god of Thor that we're going to be hearing about today. So you can just sit back and enjoy. Now, the Vikings believed that there were many gods and goddesses and that they lived in a land above the sky called Asgard. Asgard was connected with Earth by a rainbow bridge, but only the gods could walk on the rainbow bridge. The Vikings believed that Odin, who is the king of the gods, lived in a great feasting hall called Valhalla. After great battles on Earth, Odin would send warrior maidens called Valkyries down the rainbow bridges to gather up the souls of dead warriors and to bring them back to Valhalla. Now Thor, the thunder god, was one of the most warlike of all the Viking gods, and so he was one of their very favorites. He was a short-tempered god, always getting himself into trouble with no reason, just like thunderstorms that blow suddenly up out of the middle of a hot afternoon. This is one of the stories that the Vikings told about Thor. This is called Thor and the Giant King. Now, one fine afternoon, the gods were feasting in Asgard. They ate, drank, and told stories. But as night came on, the mead ran out, which was their alcohol. There was nothing left to drink, and no kettle left to brew more mead in. The gods began to sulk, which means kind of grumpy. No mead, they complained. We might as well go home and go to bed. But Thor arose from his seat. I'll go and get mead for the feast, he said. The giant Skymir has a kettle a mile wide, full of the most delectable golden honey-flavored mead I've ever tasted. I'm off to take his kettle and his mead. That is pretty ambitious. He wants to steal the kettle that is a mile wide. So Thor leaped into his goat-drawn chariot, and drove it down the rainbow bridge to Earth. He thundered along in his chariot until the sun had set and dark covered the land. Off to the side of the road, he saw the lights of a humble peasant house. He yawned. I'm tired of traveling, he said to himself. I'll just stop for the night. So he drew his chariot up to the low stone house, tied up his goats, and swaggered in. He's feeling confident. As soon as the wife of the house saw him, she dropped her clay bowl of bran on the floor. One of the gods is in my house, she wailed, and I have nothing to feed him but some bran and water. Never mind, Thor said. We'll eat my goats. So he walked out to the chariot, killed his goats, skinned them, and gave them to the woman to roast. He put the goat skins down beside the table. Eat as much as you like, he said to the woman and to her husband and her children. But don't break the bones, he said, and put them all back on top of the skins when you're finished. Tomorrow I will need them. Very curious. So the poor family ate and ate and ate until they were full. Thor collected the bones and the skins, tied them up, then lay down next to the fire to sleep. Soon his snores were shaking the house. Now the oldest son of the family, who is called Thialfi, was kept awake by the snoring. By midnight, he was hungry again. Remembering the delicious goat meat, he licked his lips. What is he going to do? Finally, he crept down to the goat skins, slid a thigh bone out from underneath Thor's arm, cracked it open. Thor specifically said not to crack them, and he sucked out the bone marrow. Now there is kind of some meat, some protein in the bone marrow inside the bones. That's what he's getting at. Now, in the morning, Thor woke up stretched and bounded to his feet. He swung his giant hammer over top of the goat skins. Immediately, the goats stood before him, whole and alive. So that's why he wanted to keep the bones. He was able to resurrect the goats. "Let's go," Thor shouted. He drove the goats towards the door. But what's going to be the problem, do you think? One of those bones was cracked open. What does that mean for the goat? He saw that one goat was limping. In anger, he shouted, "Who broke my goat's leg?" The woman and her husband and their children fell down on the ground in terror. But the son, Thialfi, stood up, even though his knees shook with fright. "I did it, Thor," he said bravely. "Then you will come with me as my servant," Thor ordered, "and together we will journey to the land of the giants to steal the mead kettle that belongs to Skymir." So together the two set off. Soon Thor yawned again. "Time for a nap," he said. "Look around for a place where I can rest undisturbed." He halted the chariot, and Thialfi scurried off. Soon he returned. "There's a cave just around the next curve, O Thor," he reported. "It has 5 dry, warm caverns. We can sleep there." Thor followed the boy around the bend in the road. Sure enough, a cave with 5 smaller rooms in it was just visible through the trees. He lay down in the nearest cavern, pulled his cloak over his head, and drifted off to sleep. But a terrible roaring and thundering woke him up. "What is that noise?" he demanded. "I'm the only god who can bring the thunder." He scrambled out of the cave and followed the sound of the roaring. On the other side of the forest, he saw an enormous man stretched out asleep, snoring. His fingers, just a single finger, was longer than Thialfi was tall. And even lying down, his stomach raised higher than Thor's head. Enraged, Thor swung his mighty hammer and struck the snorer right between the eyes. Such an enormous blow would have driven a tree right into the ground like it was a matchstick. But the giant snored and reached up just to flick at his forehead. That's with the mighty Thor's hammer. "Dratted flies," he muttered. His eyes opened and he saw Thor with the hammer in his hand, ready to strike again. The giant sat up and just chuckled a little bit, and his laugh shook the ground. "Who is this little man with his tiny hammer?" he asked. "Can this be the mighty Thor, come to see me all the way from Asgard?" "Who are you?" Thor demanded. "Why, I am Skymir the giant, of course, who lives in the castle just up there." The giant yawned and glanced around him. "Oh, I see you found my glove. I wondered where I dropped it." And with that, he picked up the cave where Thor had been sleeping and drew it onto his hand. When Thor realized that the 5 caverns were actually the fingers of the giant's gloves. So each little finger of the glove was like a little cave. He felt very foolish, but he was determined to steal Skymir's kettle. "Well," he demanded, "aren't you even going to ask me in for a feast? Don't you know how to welcome the gods?" Thor's got something up his sleeve. "A feast?" Skymir asked. "Certainly. Come on, little man." He leapt to his feet and strode across the ground, each single step covering a mile. Thor whipped his goats into a gallop just to keep up with him. Thialfi was left far behind. Soon they arrived at gates that reached so far up into the sky that Thor could not even see the tops of them. Skymir pushed them open and showed Thor into his feasting hall. Thor clambered up onto a bench and stretched his neck to peer up onto the table. There he could see Skymir's kettle, and next to it an enormous horn filled with mead. That's what he's there for. "I'd offer you some mead," Skymir sighed, "but my horn is too large for you to drink from." "Nonsense," Thor snapped. "Give it here." He seized the horn and tipped it to his lips. He drank and drank and drank until he thought he would burst. But the mead in the horn remained at the same level. Finally, he dropped the horn, gasping for breath. It's not magical, it's just that there's so much of it. He can drink all he wants, and it's barely going to make a dent. Dear me, Skymir said, is the horn too full for you? Well, what else can I offer you? Perhaps you'd be better off playing with my cat. He lifted his finger, and an enormous gray cat bounded into the hall. It patted at Thor with one enormous paw. Thor braced himself, but the cat licked him with its rough tongue and knocked him flat onto the floor. Enraged, Thor leapt up, put his shoulders against the cat's belly, and did his best to heave it from the ground. But the cat arched its back and purred. All Thor could do was to lift one paw from the ground. You're even weaker than I thought, Skymir said gloomily. I'll find you a playmate worthy of your strength. He opened a door at the end of the hall, and in shuffled an old bent woman, so ancient that she could barely move, and so shriveled that she seemed more like a raisin than a human being. Here, Skymir said, wrestle with my old nanny. Thor hurled himself at the old woman, but she raised one skinny arm and threw him to the ground. Oh my goodness, that's embarrassing for Thor, who is a mighty, strong, brave god. This old woman knocked him over, and she pinned him down. He struggled and he huffed and he strained, but she put one old foot on his chest and kept him on the ground. Skymir leaned down. Well, Thor, do you think you can steal my kettle now? What do you think he can do now? Thor, who was humiliated, could only shake his head. Then let me tell you what you have done, Skymir said. When you swung your hammer at my head, you struck the earth so hard that you opened a valley 3 miles wide and a mile deep. It's almost like the Grand Canyon. When you drank from my horn, you were actually drinking from the sea. And you drank so much that you lowered the ocean, the surface of the ocean. I thought you would drink the sea dry. When you lifted my cat, you were actually lifting the Midgard serpent, the world serpent that lies around the edge of the earth with its tail in its mouth. You should not have been able to budge it, but you lifted it almost to the sky. But despite your might, you could not beat the old woman because she is old age. And no one can conquer old age, meaning everybody ages eventually. You can't beat that. It brings even the strongest of men to the earth, weak as children. Thor roared out with fury over the giant's trickery. He jumped to his feet and swung his hammer over his head, ready to fight. But in a moment, the giant, the old woman, the horn of mead, the cat, and the castle itself all shimmered into the air. And Thor stood alone in the middle of a lonely forest, swinging his hammer and shouting at emptiness. So that's Thor and the Giant Feast. I would love for you now at this point to draw a picture of what you think Thor looks like, as well as the other events of this story. Imagine how big this giant is if his finger is about the size of this boy. And the cat, the gloves of the giant, looked like caverns next to Thor. So I want you to draw a picture of one of the scenes of this story. And you'll submit it. You'll actually upload those, at least one picture. Although if you enjoy and do a few of different scenes from the story, you can certainly do that and upload more. That is all for today, but we will have other Norse myths that we'll read from, actually just a moment. From this book, Dolaire's Book of Norse Myths. You might have read from the Greek version of this. So it has some excellent stories. At the front is actually the map of Asgard. Part of it is Asgard, and then the other parts of the Viking myth world as well. So it's a really interesting book. We've got stories of creation, according to what the Vikings believed in creation, with some excellent pictures throughout, some of them quite gruesome. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to go to the table of contents and see where the story we just read. There's the story of the world tree Yggdrasil. So here is Thor with his goats, as we just heard about. Okay, and we also have stories of Loki and Odin, his father, as well. So we'll be reading from this occasionally after we finish up with the Roman myth of the Aeneid soon. So that is all for today. Once again, you'll draw pictures of scenes from this story as soon as you're done. I'll talk to you later. Bye.